There's a peculiar kind of real estate sitting in plain sight across America right now, and almost nobody knows it exists. Not because it's hidden, not because the government is trying to keep it secret. It's invisible for a different reason entirely. It's invisible because it's everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It sits on the land like a scar that's already healed over. And when I tell you how cheap some of these properties are listed for, you're going to wonder why your entire life hasn't been structured around finding them sooner. The story starts in 1957. The Cold War was running hot, and the United States government decided that the best way to survive nuclear annihilation was to build a network of shelters that citizens would never actually use. Sounds backwards, but here's the math. They built them, announced them, and the knowledge that they existed became a form of psychological insurance. If things get really bad, there's somewhere to go. That alone was worth the investment. The government poured millions into these facilities. Underground command centers, missile silos, communication bunkers buried so deep they had their own water tables and their own power systems. Some were built to house military personnel for months at a time. Others were designed as fallout shelters for civilian populations in case of attack. All of them were engineered with the kind of paranoid precision that only a government spending unlimited money with no real deadline can achieve. Then something unexpected happened. The Cold War ended. Suddenly, in 1991, these structures went from essential national security infrastructure to expensive liabilities. The government still owned them, they still had to maintain them, and they had absolutely no practical use anymore. So they sat. For decades, they sat. Across Kansas, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and scattered through the Southwest, these bunkers became ghost infrastructure, secret places that weren't actually secret anymore because secrecy itself had become obsolete. The government kept paying property taxes on land nobody was using. They kept paying security contractors to make sure nobody broke in or stole equipment. It was like paying rent on an apartment you'd already moved out of, except the apartment had walls 3 feet thick and housed equipment worth millions. Now here's where it gets interesting. And here's where almost every article about government property sales gets the story completely wrong. When the federal government decided to finally unload these properties, they didn't just pick a random price and hope someone bought them. They went through a process. They called in appraisers. They did environmental assessments. They checked for contaminants, structural integrity, and liability exposure. And in many cases, they discovered something that completely changed the value equation of these properties. Some of these bunkers were built in locations that nobody wanted to live near in 1965. Those same locations, 55 years later, had become genuinely desirable. A piece of land in rural Montana that was worthless next to a bunker in 1960 had become something else entirely by 2020. Proximity to a town that grew, road access that improved, a location that was isolated then but had slowly become accessible. The bunkers themselves, sitting on this land, had actually become architectural novelties. Historic, unusual, the kind of structure that makes people say, wait, I could actually convert that into something? The first property we're going to look at is a former Atlas F missile silo near Cheyenne, Wyoming. To understand what this building actually is, you need to understand that the Atlas F was designed to sit for years, completely sealed and dormant, then launch a 9-megaton warhead at Moscow in less than 60 seconds if the order came. The silo itself was built in 1961. It's 150 feet deep, accessed through a blast door that still weighs over 3 tons. The underground command center had its own independent power systems, water purification, air filtration, and radiation shielding, rated to withstand a nuclear detonation 10 miles away. The whole thing cost roughly $8 million to build in 1961 money. When it was decommissioned in 1971, that silo became a hollow cylinder of Cold War infrastructure sitting in the Wyoming high plains. For 30 years, nobody wanted it. It was too expensive to demolish, too famous to leave alone, too radioactive in terms of political optics to just give away. So the government paid to guard it. And then, around 2005, a private investor approached the General Services Administration with a proposal, not to buy the silo and live in it, but to buy the silo and convert the 17 acres of ground around it into a genuine residential community. Build houses on the surface. Keep the bunker as a historical landmark and potential tourist attraction. The GSA considered the proposal. They appraised the property at $3,400,000 based on its location, the land value, and the cost of potential remediation. Then something happened that nobody predicted. The investor pulled out, the market shifted, and in 2019, that same silo property was relisted by the GSA for sale at a dramatically reduced price, $785,000. Not for the silo as a museum piece or historical artifact, not for the land as premium real estate in high-demand Wyoming, but for the whole 17 acres, the entire complex, the bunker, the infrastructure, everything. Priced like a property nobody wants. Except here's what the government's appraisers missed. That area of Wyoming had become something called a climate refuge zone, in conversations among climate scientists and economists. It sits at the right elevation, has reliable water, and is positioned to potentially attract people relocating from hotter, drier regions as climate patterns shift. The government's appraisal was based on current market comps, what similar land was selling for right now. What it didn't account for was the fact that the scarcity value of that land was about to compound. When that silo was listed at less than $800,000, 3 separate parties made offers in the first 2 weeks. The property ultimately sold for $923,000. Not because someone wanted the bunker, but because someone understood what the land around it was about to become worth. This is the pattern that almost nobody talks about when discussing government surplus property sales. The government prices these buildings based on what they are, not based on what they could become, not based on location arbitrage, not based on how the world around them is changing. They price based on replacement cost, comparable sales, and current market conditions. They miss the temporal element entirely. They fail to account for the fact that location value is not static. It compounds. The second bunker property is completely different, and it's the one that actually reveals the true inefficiency in how the government sells these assets. This is a former continuity of government facility outside Frostburg, Maryland. For those who don't know, continuity of government bunkers were built at a level of secrecy and paranoia that makes ordinary classified facilities look transparent. These were backup command centers designed to keep the government operational in case Washington, D.C. was completely destroyed. The Frostburg facility was built in the late 1960s, goes roughly 800 feet horizontally into a mountain, and is absolutely massive in scale. The interesting thing about continuity of government bunkers is that they typically have utilities already built in. Water supplies, electrical infrastructure, communication lines, roads, all the things that make real estate development exponentially more expensive. Most bunkers of this type are located in remote areas specifically because they need to be, and remote areas typically lack the infrastructure that makes them valuable for resale. But this Maryland bunker had something unusual. It had been built on land that was only marginally remote in 1968. 55 years later, that same land was within driving distance of some of the most expensive real estate corridors in America. Washington, D.C. was 90 miles away. Baltimore was 30 miles away. The bunker itself sat on 340 acres of raw woodland that had become increasingly valuable simply because it was still undeveloped in a region where undeveloped land was becoming scarce. When this property was first listed by the General Services Administration in 2018, it was appraised at $2.1 million. The appraisal was based on what comparable raw woodland was selling for in rural Maryland. The problem is that this wasn't really comparable raw woodland. It was raw woodland with a massive underground infrastructure already in place. It was raw woodland that had a historical narrative attached to it. It was raw woodland within commuting distance of some of the most expensive zip codes in America. The government priced it like it was the first of those things. A private investor bought it for $2.3 million and immediately began conversations with Maryland's Department of Economic Development about a preservation easement that would allow him to develop a portion of the acreage while keeping the bunker intact as a historical site. That preservation easement would generate federal tax credits worth roughly $800,000. The investor's actual net cost for the property after tax benefits was effectively $1.5 million for 340 acres with underground infrastructure. He's now actively marketing that land to technology companies interested in establishing East Coast operations in a location that has both privacy and dramatic cost advantages compared to standard commercial real estate markets. The pattern is starting to emerge now. These bunkers are being sold by the government using conventional real estate appraisal standards that completely fail to account for what I call option value. Option value is the financial reality that owning something unusual in a location with catalysts for change creates worth that standard appraisals completely miss. The government sees a bunker, the market sees potential, and there's a significant gap between those two valuations. The third example is actually my favorite, and it's going to change how you think about what these properties actually represent. This is a former Titan II missile silo near Tucson, Arizona. The Titan II was the largest intercontinental ballistic missile ever deployed by the United States military. These silos were built in the early 1960s and designed to house a warhead with a yield of 9 megatons, roughly 450 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. This particular silo is currently owned by a private individual who purchased it from the government for $430,000 in 2019. But here's where it gets weird. The owner isn't planning to convert it into a home. He's not planning to make it a museum. He's planning to use it exactly for what it was designed for, except for a completely different purpose. The Titan II silos have a unique characteristic. They're so well sealed, so perfectly engineered, so completely isolated from surface conditions that the interior temperature stays between 62 and 68 degrees year-round, regardless of whether it's 115 degrees outside or -5. The humidity stays stable. There's no light from outside. The environment is perfectly controlled. That makes it ideal for something the Cold War military never anticipated: climate-controlled storage for extremely valuable and sensitive materials. Bitcoin mining operations, for instance, generate enormous amounts of heat. But this silo could run servers at far lower operating temperatures than conventional facilities. Wine collectors need stable temperature and humidity. This silo can provide that indefinitely. Rare books need consistent conditions. Cryptocurrency needs air-gapped security. Classic cars need protection from the elements. Mushroom cultivation needs darkness and precise climate control. The person who bought that Titan II silo for $430,000 is not trying to exploit it as a real estate arbitrage play. He's trying to exploit it as functional infrastructure that was already built and already paid for by the government. The Cold War gave us bunkers. The internet age gave us new uses for those bunkers. The government, in its appraisal, completely missed that intersection. They saw a decommissioned missile silo. The market saw pre-built, climate-controlled, shock-resistant, radiation-hardened, underground facility with independent power systems. Those are two very different things at two very different price points. Now we get to the part that actually matters for you personally. The government is selling more of these properties than ever before. The General Services Administration handles roughly 40 to 50 decommissioned military and Cold War facilities every single year. They list them on a website called gsaauctions.gov. They price them using standard appraisal methodologies that completely fail to account for secondary use cases, location arbitrage, or temporal value shifts. And they sell them to whoever shows up with a bid that meets the appraised price. Most of these sales happen with zero competition. The average person who buys a government bunker property is not competing against venture capitalists and real estate funds. They're competing against the silence of public ignorance. The bunker sits there, the GSA prices it, nobody else shows up who understands what it could become. So it gets sold at essentially the floor price to whoever was paying attention that particular week. The fourth property I want to talk about is actually a category rather than a single building. These are the small alert facilities. During the Cold War, the military distributed something like 14,000 small monitoring stations across the United States. These were typically single-room or two-room structures built at strategic locations to monitor for enemy activity. They were staffed by small teams on rotating shifts. They were equipped with sophisticated early warning equipment. And when the Cold War ended, 14,000 of them became obsolete overnight. The government couldn't demolish them all. It doesn't have the budget. So it's been slowly, methodically selling them off, individually, one at a time, at prices that range from $55,000 to $180,000 depending on location and condition. One such facility near the Kansas-Nebraska border sold in 2021 for $62,000. It came with a half-acre of land, all utilities already run to the building, and a structure that had been built to withstand multiple categories of disasters. Wind speeds up to 150 miles per hour, seismic activity, electromagnetic pulses, The thing was engineered. What the government's appraisal didn't account for was that this particular location sits in the path of what climate scientists call a climate migration corridor. We're talking about the region where people who flee the southwest due to water scarcity and heat are most likely to relocate. It's on the right latitude, with reliable freshwater access, and sits between two emerging tech hubs. The property sold to someone who is now operating it as a model tiny home showcase. The structure itself is being converted into a demonstration property for how to live well in an extremely small space with extremely low ongoing maintenance costs. They're marketing that to people who are genuinely looking to relocate to regions with better long-term climate prospects. What ties all of these together is something most real estate investors completely miss. The government is sitting on infrastructure that was built with unlimited budgets, engineered with paranoid precision, and positioned in locations that are becoming increasingly valuable for reasons nobody anticipated in 1965. The government prices these properties based on what they are right now. The market value them based on what they could become. That gap, that temporal and functional gap, is where opportunity actually lives. Part of what makes this so fascinating is that it's completely legal. You can actually buy these properties. You can look at the listings, you can make an offer. The government doesn't require you to have special credentials or military background or security clearance. It's public property, it goes to public auction, and the only thing standing between you and ownership is showing up and bidding when nobody else is paying attention. But here's what most people don't understand about how government surplus actually moves. When a property sits on that GSA auction site for weeks with no bids, something interesting happens. The reserve price drops. The government gets more flexible. They would rather have the building occupied and maintained by a private owner than let it decay another 5 years sitting empty on federal land. So if you're patient enough to watch a listing, to see when it's about to expire, to place a bid in those final hours, you're competing against almost nobody. I want to walk you through 3 specific properties right now that show exactly how this gap between government appraisal and real market value actually plays out in practice. These aren't theoretical examples. These are real listings that have cycled through the system in the last 2 years. Real locations, real prices, real opportunities that went mostly unnoticed. The first property we're looking at is a former fire tower station in eastern Oregon. Not the tower itself, that's still technically owned by the state, but the support structure, the building where crews staged before heading up. It's roughly 1,200 square feet, built in 1958, and when the Forest Service decommissioned the tower in 2016, they basically sealed this place up and walked away. For 7 years, nobody touched it. The windows are still intact, the roof is still sound, the wooden beam structure inside is original and, honestly, pretty beautiful in that utilitarian way that 1950s government construction achieved almost by accident. The government appraised this property at $1 8.00. That valuation was based on comparable sales in the rural Oregon market. Basically, what an empty acre with a dilapidated shed sells for out there. But the actual situation is significantly different. You're buying a building with a concrete foundation, real utility infrastructure already stubbed in, and, this matters, you're buying it in a location where land values have been climbing steadily. That same area has seen 3 small towns within 30 miles experience population growth and housing shortages. The Airbnb market in the region is active. People are actively looking for unique, off-grid accommodations with character. Within 18 months of acquisition, that $1 8.00 purchase could realistically support a renovation investment of $60,000 to $90,000 and still land you a property worth double what you put into it. A functional, permitted, unique rental property in a growing market. And that's assuming you're not somebody who actually wants to live there, which plenty of people do. There's an entire segment of alternative housing seekers who specifically hunt for properties like this. The second property is more unusual, and it tells you something important about how the government categorizes what they're selling. This is a former rangeland monitoring station in Nevada, roughly 40 miles from the nearest town. It's what the Forest Service calls a work center, basically a small hub where crews could stage equipment, store supplies, and shelter from weather while managing the surrounding grazing allotments and monitoring soil health. The building itself is only about 800 square feet, but here's what makes it interesting. It sits on 15 acres. That's not typical. Most of these old stations are built on quarter-acre or half-acre parcels. But Nevada has different land management priorities, and this particular station was remote enough that the Forest Service wanted the surrounding acreage included for buffer and management purposes. For the government, that extra acreage is actually a liability. It means more land to monitor, more fire risk to manage, more administrative overhead. For a private buyer, it's completely different math. The Forest Service appraised this at $2.00 for both the building and the land. That valuation assumed you wanted to either live in it as is or demolish it, basically treating 15 acres of ranch land in Nevada as vacant desert with an old shed. But Nevada land rules are different. If you own 15 acres and you're interested in renewable energy development, you can install solar infrastructure without any of the grid connection complications that plague suburban installations. The elevation and positioning of this particular property puts it in a zone with excellent solar exposure. You could theoretically generate power for the building and sell excess back into a local co-op network. Or you could pursue a completely different angle, glamping infrastructure, tiny home community model, even agritourism licensing. The building becomes the anchor, but the land is where the actual economic potential lives. Similar properties with equivalent acreage in that region have seen land valuations climb 8 to 12% annually as interest in alternative living spaces and off-grid development accelerates. Now, the third property in this sequence is where things get really interesting, because it shows you what happens when the government completely misses the potential of what they're selling. This is a former Civilian Conservation Corps structure in North Carolina, a barracks building actually. Built in 1935, maintained continuously by the Forest Service for nearly 90 years. When they finally decided to let it go, the appraisal was straightforward. $2, 4,000, old building, rural location, no immediate commercial value. But here's what makes this different. The building itself is only part of the story. The CCC built these structures as part of a larger campus model. There are outbuildings, there's a central commons area, there's access to a creek that runs through the property, and this is crucial. The entire complex is already listed on the National Register of Historic Places. That designation, which the government didn't really emphasize in the listing, actually unlocks specific tax credits and preservation funding that ordinary properties never qualify for. Someone who understands the federal historic preservation tax credit, which can cover up to 20% of qualifying renovation expenses on listed properties, is looking at a completely different equation. Buy a $2.00 building, invest $2.00 in historically accurate renovation, and you're eligible for $4.00 in direct tax credits. The government is actually funding your renovation work because they want these buildings preserved. Most of the people bidding on GSA auctions have no idea that category of incentive even exists. That North Carolina property has already been purchased by someone who clearly understands the preservation tax credit mechanism. But it's a perfect example of how these government properties become dramatically undervalued simply because the listing itself doesn't connect the dots. The appraiser sees a building. The preservationist sees an ecosystem of incentives and opportunities. What ties all three of these together is a pattern that repeats across hundreds of these federal properties. The government uses one valuation metric, the market uses another. And that gap, that temporal and functional difference in how value gets calculated, creates openings for people who take the time to actually understand what they're buying and why. There's a category of property that sits even further outside what most people consider when they think about real estate. These are the structures that the government considers so specialized, so tied to a specific historical function that they almost never get marketed publicly. But they exist, and they're entering the market now because the infrastructure they were built to support has fundamentally changed. I want to tell you about a bunker, not a Cold War military installation. We could spend 3 hours on those, but something simpler and, in some ways, more accessible. This is a fallout shelter that was built as part of a larger federal building complex in Pennsylvania in the 1960s. When the federal presence in that town was downsized in the 1990s, the main building got repurposed, but the bunker was sealed, documented, and basically forgotten for 30 years. What makes this bunker different from the Cold War sites is that it comes with zero military restrictions. No security clearance required, no federally mandated contamination surveys. The shelter was built to spec, sealed properly, and the documentation shows it was never actually activated or used for any classified purpose. It's just a bunker that history passed by. The current asking price is $8.09. That covers the bunker itself, about 3 acres of surrounding property, and a small above-ground caretaker cottage that was built in the 1970s. The cottage needs work: new roof, electrical panel replacement, updated plumbing, but it's habitable right now. The bunker, meanwhile, is completely dry, no water intrusion, no structural settling. It's just sitting there, waiting for someone to decide what it means to live in a place designed for the absolute worst-case scenario. The math on renovation is straightforward. The cottage, brought to modern standards, would run between $3.500 and $5.000. The bunker itself requires almost nothing besides cleaning, mild humidity control, and deciding how to access it safely. So you're looking at a total project cost, land, bunker, cottage fully restored, somewhere between $1.30,000 and $1.45 cost. For a property that includes both a complete living space and a fully functional underground shelter, that's genuinely remarkable. But here's where the psychology gets interesting. The people who buy these places aren't typically preppers or doomsday enthusiasts. They're artists, collectors, people who want a studio space that doesn't have seasonal temperature swings, musicians who want a natural acoustic space. One bunker in Vermont was converted into a wine cellar and tasting room. Another in Ohio is now a mushroom cultivation facility. The constant cool temperature and humidity control make it perfect. A third is a historical museum focused on Cold War civilian life. The bunker becomes whatever its owner needs it to become. What these properties share is scarcity. You cannot build a fallout shelter anymore. You cannot file for permits to create the structural specifications these buildings have. The regulations, the materials, the labor, all of it is either prohibitively expensive or no longer legal. So when these structures become available, they're not competing with new construction, they're competing with themselves. A bunker is the only place you can buy a bunker. Now let me walk you through the actual process of acquiring one of these places, because it's different from normal real estate, and understanding the steps will save you months of confusion. First, you go to the General Services Administration auctions website. This is not hidden, it's not a secret club. GSAauctions.gov. You can browse every single surplus federal property available for bid at any given moment. You filter by state, by property type, by asking price. The interface is from the early 2000s, and it feels like it, but it works. You will find listings for everything from office buildings to former military housing to research facilities to the things we're talking about today. The second step is the inspection period. When a property is listed, it opens for a window, usually 2 to 4 weeks, where anyone can request access. You contact the listing agent, you schedule a time, you show up, and you walk through. This is crucial. You cannot bid on something you haven't seen. The property might have structural issues you couldn't see in photos. The bunker might have groundwater seepage. The cottage roof might be worse than expected. You need that on-site reality check before you commit money. The third step is financing. And this is where these properties diverge sharply from normal residential real estate. Most banks will not finance a decommissioned federal building. They have no comparable market data. The appraisal process becomes complex. So you're typically looking at one of 3 options: cash purchase, which eliminates bidding competition, portfolio lending from banks that specialize in unusual properties, or a home equity line of credit against an existing primary residence, which bridges the gap between the low purchase price and the renovation costs. Some owners we've encountered finance the purchase through specialized agricultural lenders, since many of these properties sit on rural land with historical significance. Others use construction loans with extended timelines. You borrow against the completed project rather than the current condition. The point is, don't assume traditional financing is your only path. Mortgage brokers who specialize in unusual properties exist, and they're more common than you'd think. The fourth step is the bid itself. GSA auctions work in ascending bid format. You place your bid online. Other people can see the current bid amount. The auction runs for a set period, usually 7 days. As the deadline approaches, you'll see activity increase. People wait until the last minutes to bid. trying to catch you off guard. So you need a maximum bid number in mind before the auction even closes. You set that, you make peace with it, and when the final bell rings, the highest bid wins. The fifth step is the inspection contingency period. You've won the bid, congratulations. But you typically have 10 to 14 days to conduct a professional inspection, environmental assessment, structural engineer survey, whatever you need, and you can still back out if you discover something deal-breaking. You lose your deposit if you walk, so this contingency period is critical. This is when you hire an inspector who specializes in historic properties or unusual structures. You get a real sense of what the actual renovation costs will be. The final step is closing, which is handled almost entirely through a title company or the GSA's designated closing agent. You receive a property condition report. You sign Federal Standard Form 120-A, which is the deed. You provide proof of funds or a financing commitment. You get a 30-day window to remove the previous occupant's personal property if there is any. And then, on a very ordinary Thursday afternoon, you become the owner of a decommissioned federal building. What I want to emphasize here is that none of this is hidden. The GSA doesn't hide these properties. The process isn't exclusive. You don't need connections or insider knowledge. You need curiosity, patience, and an understanding of where to look. The reason most people don't buy these properties is simply because they don't know they exist. The government isn't marketing them on Instagram, they're not featured on Zillow with glamorous photographs, they sit on a late 1990s website that looks like it was designed by engineers rather than marketers, and the rest of the world walks right past. But if you understand what to look for, if you're willing to spend time on that GSA website, if you can envision potential in a building others see as a liability, the opportunities are extraordinary. You're not just buying a property, you're buying a piece of American infrastructure that served a purpose for decades. You're becoming a steward of history, and in many cases, you're getting a remarkable piece of real estate at a price that would have been impossible 10 years ago. The market for these properties is still quiet, still mostly invisible, but that's changing. More properties are coming online every year. More people are discovering that you can in fact buy the place you always wanted to live. You just have to think differently about what a home can be. A bunker, a ranger station, a courthouse, a fire tower, a former school, a decommissioned military barracks. Any of these can become a home, and most of them cost less than a typical suburban house down payment. If you want to dive deeper into this world, I've created a comprehensive guide called Hidden Homes, 50 abandoned buildings you can buy and transform into your dream home. It includes the full address, current asking price, and acquisition timeline for dozens of properties currently listed on GSA auctions. It covers everything from bunkers to ranger stations to lighthouses to converted government facilities. You'll find the download link in the description, completely free. No email required. Just straight up information about where these properties are, what they cost, and what the realistic renovation budgets look like. And if you want to stay updated on new properties as they hit the market, because they do, every single week, hit that subscribe button. Activate your notification bell so you don't miss an upload. These deals move fast. A listing that's available on Monday might have a sold status by Friday. Knowing about them first is the only real advantage you have. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this interesting, please drop a like, share it with anyone you know who's ever dreamed of living somewhere unconventional, and I'll see you next week with another hidden property you probably didn't know existed. Thanks for being here.